The rock had been sitting there for 43,000 years. Nobody touched it. Nobody moved it. It waited, buried under a slab of sandstone that had cracked off the ceiling of a cave so long ago that the people who dropped it were not yet fully human as we understand the word today. Then, one afternoon in the little sandy desert of Western Australia, a team of archaeologists lifted that fallen slab away, and everything they thought they knew about the first people of this continent began to fall apart. This is not a story about dinosaurs or lost cities. It is stranger than that. It is a story about a tiny, crescent-shaped sliver of stone, barely bigger than a fingernail, that quietly rewrote the timeline of human survival on the harshest continent on Earth. And it starts in a place most people will never see, a place so remote and so brutal that even now, in the middle of the 21st century, you can drive for hours without passing another living soul. Deep in the interior of Western Australia lies a region called the Little Sandy Desert. It is part of a larger, older, more punishing landscape known as the Western Desert, a place of cracked earth, spinifex grass, and heat that can kill an unprepared traveler in a single afternoon. Hidden within this desert, tucked into a jumble of ancient sandstone cliffs, is a rock shelter called Carnatukel. Its older name, given by European surveyors who had no idea what they were standing on top of, was Serpent's Glen. But to the traditional custodians of this land, this place has always carried a much deeper meaning, one that stretches back further than most of human history as it is normally taught. Archaeologists first came to Carnatukel in the 1990s. They knew it was old. Rock art covered its walls, faded images of snakes, turtles, and human figures layered on top of each other like pages in a book nobody had learned to read yet. But what they did not know, what nobody knew, was just how far back the story of this place actually went. Fast forward to the years leading up to 2018. A team led by archaeologists Peter Veth and Joe MacDonald, both from the University of Western Australia in Perth, returned to Carnatukel with new tools, new techniques, and a question that had haunted Australian archaeology for decades. Human beings are believed to have first set foot on this continent somewhere around 65,000 years ago, arriving on tropical northern shores after an extraordinary sea voyage across open water. From there, they spread with astonishing speed, reaching the west coast and southern Australia within a few thousand years. But the desert interior, the driest, most hostile heart of the continent, was different. Nobody could say for certain when people first dared to walk into that furnace and figure out how to live there. So the team began to dig. Carefully, patiently, they worked their way down through layer after layer of ancient sediment beneath the rock art panels at Carnatukel. And then they found it, sitting beneath rocks that had fallen from the ceiling as the shelter slowly weathered over thousands and thousands of years. A small, crescent-shaped stone tool, the kind of object you could hold between two fingers and barely notice, but this was no ordinary flake of stone. The tool was what archaeologists call a backed microlith, a small blade with one edge deliberately blunted through careful chipping, a process called backing. Tools like this were usually attached to a wooden shaft, either as a barb on the end of a spear or as a working edge for scraping and cutting organic material like wood or hide. When the team ran radiocarbon dating on the sediment layer surrounding this fragment, the results were almost unbelievable. The tool was approximately 43,000 years old. That made it roughly 10,000 years older than any similar tool ever found anywhere else on the Australian continent. 10,000 years, let that sink in for a moment, that is twice the length of all of recorded human civilization, condensed into the gap between what scientists thought they knew and what the desert had actually been hiding the entire time. But the crescent tool was not the only surprise waiting in the ground at Carnatukel. Nearby, in the same excavation, the team uncovered a scraper, a tool likely used for cleaning meat and fat off animal hides during the process of preparing them for use. This scraper was dated to approximately 47,000 years old, which meant that human beings had not simply passed through this brutal desert on their way to somewhere else. They had settled here, worked here, survived here, only a handful of thousands of years after their ancestors first arrived on the continent at all. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand what scientists had assumed before this discovery. The old model of human migration into Australia painted a slow, cautious picture. People arrived on friendly coastlines. They spread gradually along fertile, resource-rich areas. Only much later, after generations of adaptation and technological development, did they finally work up the knowledge and the courage to push into the unforgiving red heart of the continent. The desert, in this old model, was the last frontier, conquered only after everything else had already been settled. Carnatukel demolished that picture entirely. The evidence buried in that rock shelter showed that people did not creep slowly toward the desert over tens of thousands of years. They walked straight into one of the most hostile environments on the planet almost immediately after setting foot on Australian soil, and they figured out how to survive there with remarkable speed. This was not blind wandering. This was innovation under pressure, adaptation happening in real time, in a landscape that offers almost no margin for error. And there is one more layer to this discovery that makes it even more extraordinary. When researchers examined the crescent-shaped tool under a microscope, they found something that changed the story yet again. Traces of resin were still clinging to the stone. This was not a random flake of rock. It had been hafted, meaning it was deliberately fastened to a wooden handle or shaft using resin as an adhesive, creating what archaeologists call a composite tool, a technology that combines multiple materials into a single functioning object. The evidence even suggested the tool broke while it was being used, still attached in its haft, exactly as it had been when it failed on whoever was using it more than 40,000 years ago. This detail matters more than it might seem. Hafting technology, the ability to combine stone, wood, and adhesive into a single functional weapon or tool, was long considered a marker of relatively advanced technological and cognitive development. Finding clear evidence of it at Carnatookel pushed the known history of this innovation on the Australian continent back by more than 15,000 years. In other words, the people who first walked into this desert were not primitive survivors clinging to existence with the bare minimum of tools. They were engineers. They were problem solvers. They were, in every meaningful sense, fully modern human minds working with the materials the desert gave them. Of course, no discovery this significant goes unchallenged, and that is exactly how good science is supposed to work. Rachel Wood, a radiocarbon dating expert at the Australian National University, who was not part of the original research team, examined the findings and offered a note of caution. She agreed that the site was almost certainly at least 45,000 years old, but she pointed out a real limitation in the method. The charcoal used to help date the sediment layers was not necessarily created by human activity. It could have come from a natural fire. And over tens of thousands of years, artifacts can shift between sediment layers, meaning a tool found in one layer might not be exactly the same age as the material immediately surrounding it. This is not a rejection of the discovery. It is the ordinary friction of careful science, the kind of scrutiny that makes a finding stronger rather than weaker once it survives the questioning. And survive it did. Other archaeologists in the field, examining the same evidence, describe the results as confirmation of just how adaptable, resourceful, and quick to innovate these early desert societies truly were. The consensus that emerged was not that the exact date was open to endless doubt, but that people had, at minimum, reached this remote desert interior 47,000 years ago, and quite possibly even earlier than that. Radiocarbon dating itself becomes unreliable past roughly 50,000 years, meaning the true age of human presence at Carnatookel may sit right at the very edge of what this dating method can even measure. The true beginning of this story might be older still, hidden in a part of the timeline that current technology cannot fully see into. To really appreciate what all of this means, we have to zoom out and look at the bigger picture of how humans got to Australia in the first place, because that story is just as astonishing as anything found in the desert. During the last ice age, sea levels around the world were far lower than they are today. Vast stretches of ocean floor that are now submerged were once dry land. Southeast Asia and its surrounding islands formed a single connected landmass that scientists call Sunda. Meanwhile, Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were joined together into another single continent called Sahul. But even with sea levels at their lowest point, Sunda and Sahul were never physically connected. Between them lay a permanent stretch of open ocean, a barrier that no land bridge could ever cross. For early humans to reach Australia at all, they had no choice but to build something capable of carrying them across open water, and then deliberately set out to sea, not knowing what, if anything, waited on the other side. For years, scientists have debated exactly how long ago that crossing happened. Archaeological sites like Majed Bebe in the Northern Territory pointed to human presence in Australia as far back as 65,000 years. But genetic research, studying the DNA passed down through thousands of generations of Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, consistently suggested a much more recent arrival, somewhere between 47 and 51,000 years ago. For decades, these two lines of evidence simply refused to agree with each other, creating what one archaeologist described as a genuine mystery at the heart of the field. Then came a breakthrough. A team of researchers analyzed thousands of mitochondrial DNA samples collected from indigenous people across Australia and Papua New Guinea, and in doing so, they refined the molecular clock used to calculate how quickly genetic mutations accumulate over time. It turned out that mitochondrial DNA does not mutate at a perfectly steady rate, and once that inconsistency was corrected for, the genetic timeline shifted. The new estimate placed the arrival of the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders in Sahul at approximately 60,000 years ago, finally bringing the genetic evidence and the archaeological evidence into close agreement for the very first time. But the study revealed something else, too, something almost cinematic in scope. The migration into Sahul did not happen along a single path. Researchers identified two distinct routes. The major pathway carried people down through the Philippines and the island of Sulawesi. A second, smaller wave of migrants took a southern route instead, one that required an open ocean voyage of roughly 100 kilometers or more with no land visible on the horizon in either direction. Researchers studying this southern crossing were careful to point out that this could not have been an accident. Nobody drifts 100 kilometers across open ocean by chance and survives to reproduce and pass on their genes. This was deliberate. This required boats. This required planning. This required people who understood the sea well enough to trust it with their lives, and who were willing to do exactly that in pursuit of the unknown. Think about what that actually means. Somewhere around 60,000 years ago, in an era with no writing, no metal tools, no wheels, small groups of human beings built seaworthy vessels, loaded them with everything they needed to survive, and pushed off from the coastline of a world they knew, heading toward a horizon that promised nothing. They had no guarantee of finding land. They had no way of calling for help if something went wrong. They simply went. And when they arrived on the unfamiliar shores of Sahel, they did not stop moving. Within a matter of thousands of years, their descendants had pushed inland, crossed entire continents worth of unfamiliar terrain, and walked straight into one of the most hostile deserts on the planet, armed with nothing but stone, wood, resin, and the accumulated knowledge of generations who had learned to read the land beneath their feet. This is the thread that connects the ocean crossing into Sahel with the crescent-shaped tool buried at Karnatukul. It is the same story, told at two different moments in time. It is the story of a species that did not wait for conditions to become easy before attempting the impossible. It is the story of people who treated the harshest landscapes on Earth not as barriers to be avoided, but as problems waiting to be solved. And this pattern of resilience did not end with those first desert pioneers. It continued, unbroken, for tens of thousands of years afterward. At Karnatukul itself, archaeologists recovered more than 25,000 stone artifacts from the site during their excavations, along with pigments, charcoal from countless ancient hearths, and traces of the animals that once fed the people who lived there. Most of these remains date to just the last 1,000 years, a reminder that this rock shelter was not a place people passed through once and abandoned. It was a home, returned to again and again, generation after generation, for tens of thousands of years, right up until the recent past. More than 50 examples of that same backed microlith tool style were found dating to just the last millennium, showing that the technology first pioneered by those earliest desert dwellers was refined, repeated, and passed down through an unbroken chain of knowledge stretching across an almost unimaginable span of time. Elsewhere in Australia, the evidence for this kind of deep, continuous connection to the land keeps surfacing. In South Australia, researchers examining an ancient stone quarry at a site called Sugarloaf Hill were able to establish a timeline showing that Aboriginal groups mined and used materials from that location for roughly 7,000 years, part of a much larger network of trade and resource use stretching across the Murray-Darling Basin, Australia's largest river system. Findings like this are not isolated curiosities. They are pieces of an enormous, slowly emerging mosaic, one that keeps revealing the same fundamental truth over and over again. Aboriginal Australians did not simply endure this continent. They studied it, mapped it, understood its patterns, and built rich, complex, technologically sophisticated societies that thrived here for tens of thousands of years before anyone from the outside world ever knew this land existed. It's worth sitting with just how much this discovery challenges the outdated, dismissive assumptions that used to dominate the way outsiders described early Aboriginal societies. For a long time, some researchers characterized these communities as static, unchanging, and locked into simple survival strategies shaped purely by necessity. The evidence from sites like Karnatukul tells a completely different story. It shows innovation. It shows technological sophistication arriving thousands of years earlier than expected. It shows deliberate risk-taking, careful adaptation, and problem-solving at a level that matches, and in some cases exceeds, what was happening anywhere else in the world at the same point in human history. So the next time someone tells you that the desert is empty, that it is nothing but heat and silence and dust stretching to the horizon, remember what was found beneath the fallen slab of sandstone in the little sandy desert. Remember the small crescent of stone, still bearing the faint trace of the resin that once held it fast to a wooden shaft. Remember that more than 40,000 years before anyone wrote a word of history, before anyone built a pyramid or raised a city wall, human beings were already standing in that same punishing landscape, working stone with their hands, solving problems no one had ever solved before, and quietly, patiently, building a relationship with this land that has never actually been broken. The rock waited 43,000 years to tell its story. Now that it finally has, it is forcing an entire field of science to rewrite the opening chapter of the human story in Australia. And if a single fingernail-sized fragment of stone can rewrite that much history, it raises an obvious question that nobody yet knows the answer to. What else is still out there, buried beneath the next slab of fallen sandstone, waiting patiently in the dark for someone to finally come looking? Somewhere out there, right now, another rock is waiting. It has been waiting for 40,000 years, maybe longer, sitting under a slab of fallen sandstone in a place nobody has thought to dig yet. Nobody knows it's there. Nobody knows what it will change once someone finally lifts that stone away. That is the strange, quiet truth about history. It is not finished. It is not locked away in a museum case, safely explained and fully understood. It is still out there, buried, waiting for the next person curious enough to go looking. That is exactly why this channel exists. Not to tell you what happened a long time ago and leave it at that, but to keep pulling on threads like the one we just followed together, from a single crescent of stone in the little sandy desert, all the way back to an open ocean crossing that no one alive today could have survived without extraordinary courage and skill. Every discovery like Archaeological is a reminder that the story of who we are is still being written. One excavation, one radiocarbon date, one stubborn scientist willing to question the old assumptions at a time. So here's the honest truth. Stories like this do not find an audience by accident. They find one because people like you decide to stick around, to hit subscribe, to come back next week and the week after that, and to bring someone else along with them. If this video pulled you in, if you felt even a small jolt of disbelief when you heard that people were surviving in that desert 47,000 years ago, then you already understand exactly why this channel matters. You're not just watching history, you are watching the moment our understanding of history gets rewritten in real time, and that is worth showing up for again and again. Hit that subscribe button right now before you forget, before you scroll away and lose this thread entirely. It costs you nothing, and it makes sure the next story like this one lands directly in front of you the moment it goes live. And while you're at it, tap that notification bell too, because some of these discoveries do not wait for a convenient upload schedule. Science moves whenever it moves, and when a new find shakes up everything we thought we knew, you deserve to be among the first to hear about it, not the last. But subscribing is only the beginning. This channel runs on something deeper than numbers on a screen. It runs on conversation. It runs on the comment section, turning into its own kind of excavation site, where people just like you dig into the ideas raised in every video and pull out questions nobody else thought to ask. So before you close this video, leave a comment. Tell me what surprised you the most. Was it the idea that people crossed open ocean on purpose with no guarantee that land existed on the other side? Was it the discovery that a tool found in the desert was already more advanced than anyone expected, 15,000 years ahead of schedule? Or was it simply the realization that history keeps getting older, keeps getting deeper, every single time someone bothers to dig a little further down? Whatever it was, say it out loud in the comments. I read every single one, and some of the best ideas for future videos have come directly from viewers, just like you, asking the exact right question at the exact right moment. If you want to take it one step further, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Send it to the friend who always says, history is boring because nothing about a 100-kilometer ocean crossing with no compass and no guarantee of survival is boring. Send it to the person who thinks the desert is empty, lifeless, nothing but heat and silence, because we just proved together that it has been full of human ingenuity for over 40,000 years. Every share puts this story in front of someone new, and every new person who watches it becomes part of the reason this kind of research keeps getting funded, keeps getting attention, and keeps getting told the way it deserves to be told. And if you are the kind of person who likes going deeper, who cannot just watch a video like this and move on without learning more, then do not stop here. Look up the original research. Read about Archaeological and the team, led by Peter Veth and Joe McDonald. Look into the genetic studies that finally reconciled the gap between what the bones say and what the DNA says about when people first arrived on this continent. The sources are out there, freely available, waiting for anyone curious enough to keep pulling on the thread we started today. Because that is really what this comes down to. Somewhere in a desert, or cave, or beneath a layer of sediment nobody has disturbed in tens of thousands of years, the next Archaeological is already sitting there, patient, silent, waiting for the right person to come along and finally ask the right question. Maybe that person is a professional archaeologist with a trowel and a research grant. Or maybe that person is simply someone who watched a video like this one, got curious, and decided to keep learning. Either way, the story is not over. It never was. Subscribe, comment, share, and stay curious. Because the next discovery that changes everything we know is already out there, and I intend to be the one who tells you about it the moment it surfaces.